Good evening. We're back with another Lord of the Rings LCG video, and today we'll be talking about the Noldor deck archetype. So I've got two decks once again, as in the Gondor archetype video, and we will talk about what cards are essential to these decks and what can be replaced, and how the decks are designed to work. Neither of these decks were designed by me. They were designed by other players and then modified by me to fit my preferences and playstyle. So let's get started with the deck on the left. It is a Aristor deck, which means a more aggressive deck with Arwen, Círdan, and Aristor. There is no leadership hero in the deck, and therefore no Steward of Gondor potential, but Steward of Gondor is in the deck, and the way that we play it is by discarding it with Arwen's ability, and then using Reforged to get it out of the discard pile. Reforged is an interesting event. Choose an attachment with a printed cost of X in any player's discard pile and play that attachment for no cost. The chosen attachment can belong to any sphere of influence, so this allows us to play cards off sphere. It does mean that Steward of Gondor is a little bit harder to put into play than it would be with the deck on the right, which runs Denethor. But I like this because it allows for Círdan to be in the deck. I'd consider Arwen pretty essential to any Noldor deck, and if we're running Arwen and Aristor, then we'd either need to run a leadership hero as the third hero, and the best candidate for that would be Gildor, who is a Noldor leadership hero, and he's not a bad option, but Círdan I like a lot as well. Círdan allows for additional draw at the beginning of the resource phase. He has some synergy with Aristor, and he can use Narya. So let's talk about the cards in the deck and how the deck's designed to work. We've got Arwen, who discards a card from hand to add one resource to a Noldor's resource pool. She's got 3 willpower, 1 attack, and 2 shields. We've got Círdan with his 4 willpower. He draws an additional card at the beginning of the resource phase. So that will be 5 cards drawn in the resource phase, and then you discard one of those cards. Aristor draws 3 additional cards, and at the end of the round discards all cards in hand. The allies, we got Elladan and Elro here. Those two have additional effects when the other brother is in play. These two are brothers in the Lord of the Rings lore, the Sons of Elrond. While Elro here is in play, Elladan gets +2 attack. After you optionally engage an orc, ready him. While Elladan is in play, Elro here gets +2 shields. These can be important allies because one of the weaknesses of the Noldor deck is lack of defense. It's very strong in questing. You've got 7 here from the 2 heroes, Círdan and Arwen, with an additional 2 from Aristor if needed. But it's a little weak in defense, especially from the heroes. No hero has more than 2 defense. So the 3 defense from Elro here can be quite necessary. Got Elven Jeweler. You can discard cards to put Elven Jeweler into play. Eregion Survivor. While no cards are in hand, he gets +1/+1/+1. Galdor, after 1 or more cards are discarded, draw 1 card. Gildor, I can't remember the last time I used Gildor's ability, to be honest. Usually he's played for his stats. 3/2/3/3 is pretty strong stats, even for 5 cost. Ally Glorfindel, one of the best allies in the game. He can be played from the discard pile, so he synergizes with some of the other cards in the deck, which want to discard cards or have an empty hand or generate resources. And you can discard a card from your hand to ready him. So he's very, very good with some of the duplicate unique cards in the deck. Guardian of Rivendell, it's a 3 shield card, and that is very important for a deck which, as I said, is a little weak on defense. As an additional cost to play Guardian of Rivendell from your hand, you must discard 2 cards from your hand. Imaldris Caregiver, discard a card from your hand to heal 1 damage on any character. So, a lot of these cards have an effect which either forces you to discard a card to take advantage of their action, or just to play them at all. That's why, if you're going to play this deck, Aristor is so important. And Círdan is quite helpful as well in terms of keeping the cards in hand that you want. He can allow you to get an extra card in hand if you, for example, draw an extra card of Elladan, an extra copy of Elladan, and don't have a use for it because he's already on the table. For our attachments, Light of Valinor is pretty standard. Narya is very helpful because you can exhaust Narya and the attached character to choose and ready up to 2 allies. Each of these allies gets +1 attack and +1 shields until the end of the phase. Rivendell Blade, this is very helpful for attack as well. Both attack and shields are places where the Noldor deck is a little weak, and so Rivendell Blade can help a lot with that in terms of taking down the very difficult opponents. And you play Rivendell Blade by discarding it with one of the ally effects or with Arwen's ability, and then playing it with Reforged. And then you have To the Sea, an important engine card in the Noldor deck, which attaches to a Noldor character, and you exhaust it and discard X cards from your hand to reduce the cost of the next Noldor ally played this phase by X. As you can tell, you'll be discarding a lot of cards in this deck, which makes Will of the West a very important card, because you shuffle the discard pile back into your deck and remove Will of the West from the game. Lords of the Eldar is a card that I've had mixed results with. It can only be played from your discard pile. You place it on the bottom of your deck from your discard pile, and then until the end of the round, all Noldor characters get +1/+1/+1. It can be very helpful for taking down big enemies, but it is not a good card in the early game. Elven Light is a very important card for Arwen because it can only be played from your discard pile, and you return it to your hand and then draw 1 card when you play it. So you can discard it with Arwen, gain a resource, then play it from your discard pile for a resource and draw a card. So it helps to get more cards into the hand, more cards that you can discard for To the Sea, or for one of the other effects. This deck is a lot of fun to play. It cycles through your cards very rapidly with Aristor, with Círdan, with Elven Light, with Galdor of the Havens, who draws a card after you discard a card. It's a lot of fun to play this deck, to cycle through all your cards. Now, is it a strong deck? Well, similar to Gondor, it's not an elite deck. And it's weak early in both attack and defense, and so there are a number of quests, particularly Nightmare quests, but a number of normal quests too, where you have some big enemy to defeat pretty early in the game. And this deck isn't low threat. It starts at 31. So the quests where you need to face and take down a big target in combat early in the game, the Noldor deck is going to have some issues with that. For example, let's say you were playing this against the second quest of the core set, Journey Down the Anduin. You face a hill troll, which has 30 threat, and you would have to engage it round 1. You'd have your standard 2 resources from the Spirit Sphere and 1 from the Lore Sphere. And what could you play from your hand, or what could you draw that would allow you to survive that troll attack on turn 1? Eregion Survivor, Elven Jeweler would just be chump blockers. Those would be all you could play on turn 1. Potentially Guardian of Rivendell you could play at a relatively high cost, but it would simply die to the troll. So that's the kind of challenge which this deck is not good at dealing with. A big enemy in the staging area to start the game that you have to deal with right away. The Noldor deck is going to struggle with that challenge. Once you get set up, it can handle it. It's not great. You can include the Cloak of Lorien potentially in this deck, which can help you to have some more defensive ability if you're in a quest that needs it. Attached character gets +1 shield, +2 if the active location has forest. Typically it's just going to be +1. If you played that on a Guardian of Rivendell, you'd be up to 4, and 4 is decent. But even so, defense is not this deck's strong suit. You're going to have to rely on chump blockers a lot of the time in combat-focused quests. So this may not be the best deck to bring to that, or it may be a deck to bring to multiplayer mode when one of the other players can focus on combat and you use your Noldor deck to focus on questing. And then the deck performs very, very well in that circumstance if you're splitting up the responsibilities of the quest between two players. In solo play, the deck's going to struggle against any quest that requires combat early. Now, in terms of what cards can be swapped out and what cards are essential, To the Sea is absolutely essential to the Noldor deck. It's the cost reduction engine. It comes in the Grey Havens expansion, and if you've got To the Sea, then you've also got Círdan. He comes in the same expansion. Arwen is absolutely essential to the Noldor deck if you're going to play this version with Reforged, because you need a reliable way to discard the cards, such as Steward of Gondor, so that they can be played with Reforged. There are a variety of other allies that can do that. Glorfindel, Guardian of Rivendell, Imaldris Caregiver. So it's possible to play this deck without Arwen. You would swap in something like Glorfindel, remove the ally version of him, add Glorfindel in. You could also play Gildor and Glorian. In fact, if you're going to swap out Arwen and you have Gildor and Glorian, I would advise doing that, because that will remove the necessity of playing Steward of Gondor with Reforged. Gildor is a hero, or leadership hero, and you pay 1 resource to draw a card. 3 willpower. He could be used interchangeably with Arwen if you're okay with removing Elven Light. And then you would likely remove Reforged as well, and possibly the Rivendell Blades. I don't like that version as much, but it's definitely viable. If you preferred, you could also swap out Círdan for Glorfindel, and then you would swap out Narya for Asphaloth, and that version might actually be better because it would give you more combat ability early. Only a little more, but it would also it would start at much lower threat. So the example I talked about earlier, where you've got to take on a cave troll on turn 1 with the Círdan version because you start at 31 threat, well, that problem is not. It's not the case with Glorfindel as your hero instead of Círdan, because you start at 24 threat, and then you can take a few turns to get your allies built up before you engage the cave troll, and that quest becomes much, much more doable. So against certain quests, I think that Glorfindel is very, very good and arguably better than Círdan. You'd have to remove ally version of Glorfindel, of course. I would include Asphaloth, and as for the ally that I would add, probably something like Linden Navigator. Linden Navigator comes in the Grey Havens expansion, doesn't exhaust to commit to a quest, and can commit to quests while exhausted. However, after you resolve the quest to which Linden Navigator was committed, you have to discard it from play or discard 1 card from your hand. And that can be inconvenient if you had other plans for those cards in your hand. But it'll be a pick your poison situation between Glorfindel and Círdan, and may depend on the quest which one you want to use. Another option for a hero would be something like Elrond, though I don't think this deck, well, it functions okay with 2 lore heroes instead of 2 spirit heroes. We have some expensive lore cards that need to be played. 5 cost Gildor, 5 cost Galdor, 3 cost Eladan. So it's not bad. You would put Steward of Gondor in that case on Arwen, and then you'd have 2 lore heroes. You would start at 32 threat instead of 31. You could potentially remove Narya in that circumstance and play Vilya instead. And possibly you would want to include Unexpected Courage. But that version of the deck would also be fine. The most important cards that can't be swapped out, well, Aristor absolutely positively cannot be replaced if you want to play this version, the cycle version that goes through the deck, discards cards, uses Reforged, Will of the West. This version requires Aristor. It's the most fun version in my opinion. Another good option for a hero to include if you wanted to is Galadriel, a Noldor hero with 4 willpower, who allows allies you control to not exhaust to commit to the quest during the round they enter play. That's going to be very good for a deck that may be struggling in combat early because you can use one of your allies to quest and to serve as a chump blocker against enemies early. And then you would also include Galadriel's Ring Nenya if you run the Galadriel version, which allows Galadriel to contribute her willpower to a quest. In terms of ally substitutions, well, if you don't have one of these allies, you could add in an additional Eladan or Elrohir or Glorfindel or Gildor or Galdor if you have them. The only real option other than the allies here that I think is any good for the Noldor deck is the Linden Navigator, which we discussed previously. There are a couple of others that exist. Warden of the Havens is one, but it's a leadership card, so it doesn't really fit in this deck unless you're also running Gildor, and it's not that good. But it can provide some defense for a cheap cost. While the top card of your discard pile is an attachment, you can definitely control what the top card of your discard pile is, sometimes, with Arwen. Warden of the Havens gets +2 shields and gains Sentinel, so it's 3 shields for 2 cost. That will be very good in the circumstance where you can fulfill this requirement. Then we also have the Wandering Exile. 3 cost, 2/2/02. After Wandering Exile commits to the quest, discard a card from your hand to ready Wandering Exile. That's pretty good, but again, it's a leadership card and therefore requires you to play Gildor instead of Glorfindel or Círdan or Galadriel or whatever. If you played Elrond, though, you could play those 2 allies without any issue. So there's an argument to be made for a number of the Noldor heroes in this deck. But the deck is relatively short on acceptable substitutions for the allies, and I've tried a version of it without Eladan and Elrohir, and I found it lacking. I think those 2 are actually pretty important to the deck. This is a fun deck to play, though. It's a lot of fun, and I do recommend it if you have the cards for it. And it's definitely a good option if you're looking for a fun, synergistic archetype to play in a multiplayer game, and you've got a partner who plays a more combat-focused deck, then you'll have a lot of fun with this deck. I can recommend it in that circumstance. It's not going to be the most powerful deck you could bring to the table, but if that's not your goal, you just want a fun archetype to play, and you like the Noldor archetype, this is a very good and very fun to play version of the Noldor archetype, and strong on questing. A good option to bring to a multiplayer game where you want to play as the questing focused player. Let's take a look at the version on the right. This is a version that runs Denethor in order to facilitate getting out Steward of Gondor faster. Doesn't use Aristor runs Galdor of the Havens. That's an interesting Noldor hero. After drawing your setup hand, instead of taking a mulligan, you may discard any number of cards from your hand, then draw that many cards. If you have no cards in your hand, draw 6 cards once per game. So it's a little slower than Aristor, but allows you more control over your deck, and therefore it doesn't run Will of the West. It doesn't run Rivendell Blade for combat, due to the lack of Reforged in the deck. Though you could certainly include Reforged and Rivendell Blade if you prefer the version of the deck without Aristor and you still want to run those cards because you like that card. The allies are pretty close to each other. You've got Aristor, an additional Noldor ally I haven't talked about yet because he wasn't possible in the deck on the left due to it being another version of Aristor. Choose and discard 1 card from your hand to draw a card. It'll allow you to cycle through duplicates. And you've got Sailor of Lune. This is another Noldor ally that is a good substitute for any of the allies on the left that you don't have in the Swords of Noldor Reforged deck. Sailor of Lune, while the top card of your discard pile is an event, Sailor of Lune gets +1 willpower and gains cannot be damaged while committed to the quest. That's very good with Elven Light, which is often going to be the top card of your discard pile, as you discard it and bring it back with Arwen. This version also includes Heed the Dream, a very good option as well for the Swords of Noldor Reforged deck on the left. It's going to come down to your personal preference. Darren's Runes for more cycle and a very good tail to help you get out allies quicker, which is an option since we're running Hero Denethor. It's a little bit less thematic to include Denethor in a Noldor deck. You could also easily use Gildor instead, though it will be a little slower. The point of Denethor is to get those extra resources early in order to compensate for the weakness of the deck in the early game, which is combat. Overall, I think the one on the left, the cycle deck, is a little bit more fun to play, though I am biased in the direction of Aristor decks in general. But the one on the right is also a very good option. Fulfills a similar role. They both fulfill a similar role, which is questing focused decks centered around an archetype, which I find to be quite fun. I enjoy this archetype. It's not a very forgiving archetype for newer players, though, who haven't collected that many cards yet, because a lot of the cards are pretty essential. And so I think Gondor is probably a little bit more forgiving in terms of how easy it is to build it. But if you got the cards for it, I highly recommend trying out the Noldor archetype, particularly if you're in a multiplayer group and you want to bring a questing focused deck to the table. So, thank you for watching.